Here we go. All right, man. Shawney Cohen is my guest. He's the director of Rat Park. I didn't think it was out yet, Shawney, but I saw it today on Crave, so it must be just newly out, is it?
Yeah, it's been out about a week.
Okay.
I think this is the second weekend, yeah.
Okay, great. So just for the listeners or people watching, tell us a little bit about who you are and how we got to this place of Rat Park, the movie you just put out.
Yeah, my name's Shawney Cohen. I am a film director. I kind of specialize lately in documentaries. I got my start in kind of animation. But, over the last, I think, 10 years or so, I've been kind of focusing on a lot of documentary work that has to do with addiction, and not all addiction that has to do with drugs, but addiction in general. So one of the first films I did about 10 years ago was about my family, who happened to own a strip club in Guelph, and I just kind of showed up there and decided to film them. Didn't have too much of a relationship prior to filming them, which was interesting. And what I noticed was my parents were struggling with a lot of eating disorder type stuff. My mother was anorexic, and my father was like grossly overweight. And I found this really interesting, that they were struggling with body issues while working in a strip club. Since that film came out, I've found that a lot of the work that I do now that I work for Vice has a lot to do with addiction and drug use. So I would say that 5 or 6 years ago, I was one of the first filmmakers in the world to do a feature about fentanyl. And I kind of learned a lot from that experience. And Rat Park is kind of the last in a line of documentaries that really looks at addiction more from like a policy angle and what governments are doing, and tries to get deep into like the underlying layers of the drug war. And I really wanted to make a film that was kind of bigger and bolder than the addiction stuff I've done in the past.
All right, so you're obviously an artist and attracted to maybe social issues more than, the conservative right-leaning brain. What was your underlying commitment here? What did you have a goal in mind when you set out to do this project? And if so, what was it that you wanted to try and change or affect?
I think for me, I don't really go into projects with this idea that I, need to change the world or come up with a concept that is big and bold, some political statement. It really started with this curiosity, and I kind of wanted to go to the worst place in the world for drug use and the drug war, and the best place. And through all the research I've done, it kind of appeared that, there was quite a contrast between Portugal and Manila. And while hanging out in these places and filming, I realized that the environment, how people live, and how the government treats users and stigma drug users has so much to do with, how we look at the drug war and look at the problems with addiction. And, slowly after filming, this idea of Rat Park came into play. And I learned a lot from Bruce Alexander, this Canadian scientist or psychologist who basically figured out that if you put, rats in a cage and they have nothing to do and they're isolated and all they have to do is water or heroin, they'll gravitate towards the heroin. And he kind of wanted to turn this idea on its head, because in the 70s, everyone thought, you do drugs must be the cause for everything. And he figured, that's not really true. I want to kind of disprove this. So he made something called Rat Park. So he makes this giant place for rats to live in. They have treats, they can have sex, they can raise each other's young ones. And really, he just made them not isolated, and they were able to kind of run around. And he did the same thing, heroin and water. And it was quite a sophisticated experiment at its time, and he took like an obscene amount of data. And after a while, he realized that the rats in Rat Park that weren't isolated didn't gravitate as much to the heroin. And what he learned from this whole process was that you can't understand addiction unless you understand the environment you're in. And that really made a lot of sense, since I was kind of in Manila, the worst place in the world for drugs, and Portugal, the best place, because I realized that setting and the environment had so much to do with, why people use drugs, the opiate crisis, people dying in the street because they use drugs. So that experiment made sense, and I kind of tied it all together and made this film called Rat Park.
Yeah. So do you think the addiction, it sounds like you feel like it's based in hopelessness?
I wouldn't say it's based in hopelessness. There's a lot of misconceptions about addiction, I learned. We did a lot of research, and you find out little statistics like, only 10% of people who actually use drugs or abuse drugs, compared to 90% who don't.
So just let me stop you there, Shawney. That's a great point, and that's a fact. And if you can consider, I mean, I didn't research this, I've never looked it up, but that's something that jumped out at me. And what I heard, and maybe I heard it incorrectly, is that 10% of users are addicts. Like and the rest, the 90% of users are, for pleasure, and they're not addicted, and it doesn't ruin their lives. I just found that amazing. I mean, it sounds like it's probably right. I mean, the extremes are usually of the lowest percentage, but that really jumped out at me as well.
Yeah, it's actually me too. Actually, when I was researching, that's actually a UN statistic, and they do a ton of research. So it's not that the 90% use it recreationally, but 90% of people who use drugs wouldn't fall into what you, I guess, classify as an addict or someone who has a problem. Okay. But here's the issue. The 9 or 10% who do use, who have problems, like almost every government in the world base every drug policy and focuses a drug war on that 10%. And it gets complicated, and this is what's interesting about the documentary and the research. Drug policy is not sexy. Like when you watch Intervention in a lot of these shows, it just kind of shows users and people kind of form these opinions about, people using drugs and that's that. But doing Rat Park, I realized there's like a lot of like interesting information that may not be as interesting for the normal person who doesn't know anything about addiction, but drug policy is super interesting. What does that mean? So if you consider that 10%, and we make these drug laws for that 10%, and you look at all these people dying of opiate overdoses, what's really interesting is a lot of the people who are dying aren't necessarily like abusing the drug. The problem is because opiates and a lot of these drugs on the street aren't regulated and they have to go to the street to get these drugs, they're doing fentanyl and they're dying. And these aren't necessarily people who are like classically addicted. So you learn a lot about drug supply and why drugs are illegal and not illegal. And that's what I found really, really interesting.
Shawney Cohen is the director of Rat Park. What else surprised you about it? Shawney, what's something else that jumped out at me? I think I took his name down. It was one of he's featured throughout the movie. Maybe it was the addict in Manila. You're never addicted to one drug. You're addicted to altered states. I found wow. We know that, but it just sounded so profound coming from a regular daily user.
Yeah, so that guy was in Portugal, and what was interesting about Tiago was, so this is a guy who's been using crack and heroin every day, and he has problems. I'm not going to say that his life is perfect, but he just kind of wants to be left alone to be an artist, work in the studio. He's a very celebrated pottery artist in the country, and he's well known for using drugs and doing his thing. But it was interesting because when I filmed him, there was quite a small nuance between someone who would drink wine in their studio and work on pottery or write and someone that was using crack. And I mean, they're completely different drugs, and I'm not comparing them, but it got me on this idea that, let's look at how many people die from alcohol-related deaths, and it far outweighs opiates and all other drugs, which I found really interesting. But because he's using drugs, he's literally considered a user, and he has problems, and people kind of hate him. But I think the idea that if we compare in that same context to alcohol, you kind of learn a lot between why one is legal, the history of why one became legal, and the other one didn't.
Mm-hmm. And you touched on Bruce Alexander. I'd like you to expand on him a little bit more, but specifically this idea of an alternative reinforcer, an attractive alternative to, let's say, crack. And I love Diego's, how he said, I started when I was, 16 or something like that. And it was hash. And then 17 was LSD. And then I snorted some coke. And then I did some meth. And then I smoked some crack. And then he said, everything changed since I smoked the crack. It sounded like, you've got drugs. And he even said you have to learn to be a heroin addict. But again, just going back to this idea of an attractive alternative, or how Bruce Alexander, I think, called it, an alternative reinforcer. And in this case, they used money or crack. And most reasonable people, according to your movie, says that most of the time, reasonable people choose the money. That surprised me as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's an interesting idea. And so Carl Hart is, I think, one of the head psychologist at Columbia University, and he was really also obsessed with, and really interested in the rat experiments. And so he did his own experiment where he actually gave someone the option to do crack cocaine or take money. And he found that after, long enough, if the money is high enough, people will choose to take the money over crack or cocaine or whatever drug. And what that kind of taught him and the kids at Columbia was that when it comes to drug use, people have a tendency to act rationally. What does that mean? Like a lot of this theory in the 60s and 70s, when you take heroin, you take crack, you do a drug, you kind of turn into this demon, and it's like all these problems come about, and the drug kind of changes you mentally, and you're just a zombie. Believe it or not, that was kind of the school of thought, even psychologically, in the 60s and 70s. And you're seeing this science now where, that's not actually the case. People who use drugs, and we've all used drugs, you can actually act rationally, when it comes to being on drugs and choosing to use drugs. So this idea that anyone who takes a drug, is going to become immediately addicted, is crazy. And I think you're beginning to see science that really kind of disproves that. There's another great person I was researching while we were doing this, and Johann Harari. He wrote a book called Chasing the Scream, and he also mentions that. Like, there's a reason why if you break your ankle or your leg and you go to the hospital and they give you morphine, and you're on morphine for a week while you're in the hospital, and you leave the hospital, you're not going to continue using morphine because you act rationally. Listen, like I don't want to continue using morphine no matter how it makes me feel, because I want to continue on with my life. That wasn't always the thought process. In the past, people thought, all right, you're using morphine, they're instantly addicted, it's a problem. So that's basically what that experiment kind of talked about.
And how do you stop them from just using the money to go get more crack and type of, like what's the like how do you stop that from influencing the decision on what they do?
I would say this is where I've kind of come full circle. I mean, for me, I guess after making these films, I've realized that people use drugs. There's no way Tiago will ever stop using drugs. You can put him whatever AA meeting, whatever rehab, he'll never stop. So the only thing you can do is really manage the problem. And I think governments like Portugal are making that kind of, I guess, concession, this understanding that, we're not going to win the drug war, so let's manage it. So what does that mean? We're going to actually give people access to methadone. If they do get cleaner, they want help, then we'll help them find a job. And for lack of a better word, we'll just stop treating them like shit. And it was really interesting what happened. They basically took, all drug use and selling drugs out of the hands of the police and put it completely in the hands of the medical system. And it has its problems. It's not like the ideal system, and it gets a lot of criticism. But what I can say, which is really interesting about Portugal, and you can't dispute this, they were able to reduce overdose deaths by 80%. Wow. And that's a scientific fact. And you can talk to anyone who disagrees with legalizing or decriminalization. You can't dispute that fact. And an interesting, idea that comes about, people ask, well, is it going to continue to be a thing in Portugal? Is it going to continue to work? Do other governments want to do this? If you ask anyone in Portugal, at least that I met, there's no conversation about going back to the old way. Everyone kind of agrees this is, best for society. The other interesting thing that came about when they decriminalized is everyone thought more people are going to use drugs. That didn't happen, actually. It's really marginal. It's like maybe within a percentage point or two, maybe statistically I saw that, but for the most part, there's no data to support that when they decrimmed, more people started using drug and it became this like drug-free holiday place. That didn't happen. What actually happened was stigma became a lot better. What does that mean? If you have a problem, you can go to your doctor now and say, well, like I have an alcohol problem, I have a drug problem, can you help me? It's tough in Canada and North America to do that. If you have a cocaine problem, it's a big deal to tell your family and go to a doctor and say, listen, dude, I have a cocaine problem, help me. It's a lot easier if you're an alcoholic.
Yeah, because it's out in the open and it's socially accepted, and it's much easier to say, I'm probably drinking too much and cocaine's not all that much a social drug. It is something that you will kind of keep to yourself and just, go down to the basement and spend days there and nobody would be the wiser type of thing.
For sure. And I guess that was my favorite part about places like Portugal that decrim, because they help reduce stigma and they help the social aspect of it. And so when people feel they have a problem, you can talk openly about it. You can walk into a doctor's office or a harm reduction clinic on the street and say, man, you got to help me. Or, you know what, I'm not ready to quit. Do you have any clean needles you can give me? And they help you, and they do that. And the other thing that happened was they completely eradicated HIV, as far as I can tell. So for the most part, you know, here's what this all means. They decided not to fight the drug war. They just thought, just manage it. And it was a lot more successful than other places in the world, like Manila, where I went to, where, Jesus, you could just be walking on the street and you're put on a list for using drugs, and, you know, you're shot in the head because Duterte, this crazy maniac leader, decided that that's the way he wants to solve the problem.
Wow. And what type of numbers? I saw a funeral home director say that, you know, his business has gone through the roof. I think he said something like 1,000 since 2016. But then I heard another figure of like 30,000. Is that related to murders since the new regime came in?
So 1,000 was just in his funeral parlor.
Wow.
There's a ton of funeral parlors like his. So there's an excellent 60-minute segment just this weekend, and it was talking about the drug war and the problem that journalists are having while they're telling the story. So as far as we can tell, the numbers are hard to, find out exactly, but Rappler is one of the most important news organizations in Manila, and they're saying it's between 26 and 2,000 extrajudicial killings, which is pretty crazy. I mean, that's already, you know, stepping in line with a genocide.
Genocidal,
which is nuts. So, but it was nice to see that the story is still kind of being told around the world, and even on 60 Minutes. What I liked about the 60-minute story was, you know, what happens to filmmakers and journalists who go down there and tell the story. We had an issue too. We were filming someone who was just executed on the street, and the police started filming us, and it was freaking me out a little bit. So, it's not a safe place to tell that story.
I get that. And tell us a little bit about Vincent Go. He's just featured so well in this film. He's the photographer, right?
Yeah.
And
sure.
He's in Manila. He's a Filipino
photographer, photojournalist.
And seeing him joking around with his father on the couch there, I love it. He's busting his hump about, he likes Trump. I thought it was so cute.
No, it's interesting. Yeah, so it's, you know, I mean, what's really interesting about Vincent is, like, you know, this is the person who basically goes to these places where people are shot, and he documents it, and he tries to get, you know, justice by having this stuff publicized and all over the world, and he's worked with publications across the world, but he's still pretty much in the minority. What freaked me out the most about being in Manila was how popular Duterte and the drug policy is. It's widely popular, and that doesn't get talked about. Everyone just says, you know what, this Duterte guy is killing people, he's kind of this maniacal leader, but his popularity is insane, and his drug policy is insane. So, insanely popular. So, you know, that's what I found super interesting. You know, he's just being perpetuated and by the general public who actually think what he's doing is very positive. So I was surprised to see people like Vincent who are witnessing this, and you see these drug killings in the newspaper every day. The city of Manila and largely the country of the Philippines, like, very much supports what's going on.
Cool. What do you say to the people that kind of come from the school of thought like I do, that you're always going to have poor, you're always going to have mass murderers, you're always going to have a certain population of minority, a certain population and I love the idea of management. You're always going to have your addicts. And you talked about Tiago. It sounds to me like he's happy. He's doing his little pottery and his art. He doesn't. It doesn't sound like he's tomorrow I'm going to kick this thing. Tomorrow I'm getting off this. He's like, you know what? Leave me alone. If I want to put something in my body, that's my choice. So what do you say to the people that say, you know what, you can manage it, but you're never going to cure the problem of addiction. It's just, it goes inherently with the idea that we want to change. Well, I mean, we've been chewing leaves and fermenting fruit and stuff to change our state since the beginning of time. So, you know, that's not going anywhere anytime soon.
No, it's interesting. I actually agree with you. I have a bit of a libertarian approach to that. Like, for me, you know, we've been using drugs since the dawn of time. You know, I think, I don't know what the statistic is. I would imagine about 20% of the population uses drugs sometimes at some point in their life, experimented with drugs. So for me, you know, the idea that, we're going to be this kind of Puritan society and we shouldn't be using drugs, and like the mess from like Nancy Reagan, just say no. I think it's crazy because I actually feel like as human beings, we do stuff that's bad for us.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like, drugs are a part of life. Drinking is a part of life. Of course you can abuse these things,
Sure.
but excuse me. I mean, for the most part, the idea that you're going to eradicate substances is just crazy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, listen, at the end of the day, I think there needs to be more acceptance about the idea that we all use drugs. We smoke cannabis, occasionally we do coke, people drop ecstasy, people do drugs. And
it's funny how we put alcohol in a different category. We talk about alcohol and drugs. We forget that, alcohol is a drug. Coffee's a drug, for crying out loud.
Yeah, no, caffeine is actually a drug. There's tons of
stimulant,
substances.
yeah.
I mean, obviously ones are worse for you than others. I mean, you can make the argument that alcohol is actually the worst one when you think about it.
Sure
it's just
it is,
socially acceptable.
Absolutely.
It's really interesting if I go on a little rant here about the history of alcohol. So in alcohol, you had the Prohibition era, and then all of a sudden, alcohol becomes legal again. So that's like late 30s, early 40s. You had people like Harry Anslinger and a lot of law enforcement agents who, when Prohibition ended, had nothing to do. So really, they had to set their sights on something else. So they started going after drugs, marijuana and cocaine and heroin. So one of the first things that Harry Anslinger did, you can make the argument that he was the fundamental person who helped start the idea of the DEA and the drug, these drug police that kind of, went out to fight the drug war that we know today. But he actually ended up doing some crazy racist things by going after jazz singers in New York.
Yeah, and he was the king of propaganda. Even the word marijuana, I think, came from Anslinger, didn't it?
But it's fun. I'm glad you know that because he was actually a master of propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
And he started going after Mexicans, and he actually, I believe he turned the term marijuana.
Yeah.
Cocaine and heroin was a thing from, that he predominantly thought a lot of black musicians were using, which is completely racist. And you have the whole Billie Holiday story and like drove her to insanity and arrests. And anyway, so if you look at the evolution of alcohol and the evolution of, the drug war, the drug war for me started in like these really crazy racist ideals, and it just didn't end. And you just kind of, went into the next century where people still believe all these drugs and substances, unlike alcohol, are completely different. When really, the chemical difference between something like Adderall and meth are like very, very similar. So, I just kind of feel the more I've done research and the more that I understand drug culture and drug life, to get mad at people for using substances and kind of ban it is completely impossible.
What surprised you? We talked about a couple things that popped up for both of us, as I was watching, as you were creating a movie. What other surprises came up for you? And we should say, the idea was to go to the safest and most dangerous parts of the world to see the difference in how addicts, were treated and how they dealt with policy in those countries.
I guess the thing that surprised me the most was, I knew what harm reduction was, and I learned a lot more about what that means, not just for drugs, but what this idea of living with, your so-called demons or drug use or addictions and being able to manage it and really means. What does that mean? So like harm reduction is this idea that you meet people where they're at. And yes, it means things like safe injection sites and safe needle programs and like methadone, but you realize that harm reduction plays a role in everyone's life every day. A seatbelt, for instance, is harm reduction. If you're driving on the highway, you want to put on a seat. You hope you don't have to use it, but sometimes you're going to drive fast. I feel safer with it. When you're in McDonald's and you're picking a Big Mac instead of a salad, you're doing that because you see the calories that are now mandatory to be printed underneath the actual menu item.
No offense to McDonald's, of course.
No offense, but I like that principle, this idea that we, for lack of a better word, choose to live with some sin. we were never going to get rid of that. So let's just try to manage it. Maybe I'll only have one Big Mac. But if I have access to that information,
Right.
if I'm allowed to know the details of what's in some of this food, what is bad, what is wrong with cigarettes, you know, how much fat is in a hamburger. I like that information because now, you know, I know that I'm not a perfect human being. I'm going to live with all these problems, but I can manage how much of a shit I can be in life, you know? And I feel like that's what I learned. If you start to understand and do more research in harm reduction, it's everywhere. And I think when you take that principle and you apply it to drug use, it really, really helps manage the problem.
So isn't that the argument for legalization? Because nowadays, you know, I talked to a guy that's struggling with cocaine the other day. He's actually in my men's group, and it's a daily thing for him. And I said, bro, it's like, it's not, I hear you talking, but it's not cocaine. It's meth. It's methamphetamine. There is no cocaine left in today's Coke in North America. So is that the idea of legalization? So listen, you want to get heroin, you don't have to worry about the Chinese fentanyl, or you want to get cocaine or whatever, you don't have to worry about the cheap filler drugs that they're putting in it. But nowadays, I mean, with cannabis, you know what you get. With alcohol, you pretty much know what you get. But now those two are legalized and the supply is controlled. And you'd think, you know, if you're going to a regulated source, not only is the source safer, but if you're tired of it, you can throw your hands up and say, "Okay, I'm done." Where's the copy of how I get off this substance?
It's really the $1 million question, and I don't know that anyone's really figured it out. It's this idea of, you know, how do you kind of legalize it and crim harder drugs? I've just come to learn that it's a matter of choice. There's not one system that's going to work for everyone, and there's going to have to be sacrifices. What does that mean? Like, so Portugal, for instance, made a decision. Like, they arguably had a terrible opiate problem in the 90s from Afghan heroin coming in, and they made a decision. And they didn't know what would happen if more people would use or not use if they decrim, but they decided to do it for one reason only. They wanted to reduce opiate deaths. And if you look at Canada and how many people in North America are dying from, you know, doing fentanyl, there's doctors who will say it maybe makes sense to give people who use drugs, that 10%, access to prescription fentanyl. And the reason you would do that is so that they don't go to the street and buy the shitty stuff. And you're beginning to see this. There's a pilot program. I was reading in the Globe and Mail talking about this about a week ago. There's like a couple doctors in Vancouver who are beginning to prescribe fentanyl patches to hardcore users who need it. It's only 8 to 10 people, but, you know, this is legitimate doctors taking this idea, you know, into society. And it's hard for people to wrap their head around, but it all comes down to this one idea. Do we want people to stop dying? Do we accept all the other sacrifices that may come about if we decide to legalize? But at the end of the day, I make a decision to, like, not have people die. Let's start there and then kind of figure out a plan after we've made that decision. And I really feel like eventually in our lifetime, you're going to see some type of legalization or decriminalization with opiates and harder drugs. It's just a matter of time. We just have to figure out how to make it safe for everybody and how to make sure, you know, it's prescribed properly, it's not abused. But if you think about what's happening now, it seems to me like that makes the most sense. There's a lot of people who completely disagree with me, but after doing all these drug docs and going all over the world and watching what was going on, I kind of feel like that to me makes the most sense.
Did you know that rats meditate before this movie?
Yeah.
You didn't know that?
Rats do a lot of interesting things. They meditate, they raise each other's
like
children.
Rats meditate? Yeah. What, are you kidding? Come on.
Yeah. You know what was really interesting that I learned about rats, and this kind of was amazing. I haven't told many people this, but there was a lot of rats who actually did heroin. They actually, in Rat Park, they actually did heroin, but they didn't get as addicted to it as the rats in isolation. And what I found interesting about that was that animals like rats have the propensity to use drugs recreationally. Wow. I found that really interesting, and not a lot of people talk about that part of the experiment, but that's kind of what I found to be super interesting about that whole experiment. The other thing that's really interesting about Rat Park is even the rats that were high on heroin within the park, they weren't shunned. There was no stigma. It wasn't like one rat would look at the other and like, you're hot, I'm not talking to you. Which is also like a little lesson we can learn, It was a society where they didn't care about people who were, or other rats who were using drugs.
Yeah, what is it about humans that, I remember when we were back in high school, it was like you drop mushrooms. Well, you couldn't hang around with anybody that wasn't on mushrooms. You're like, no, you're not on our level. And you know what it's like when you walk into a party and you haven't had a beer and they're 10 beers in. It's just, you can't just, mingle right in. So I don't know what it is about humans.
Well, I mean, that's a good point in general. There's a lot of, humans are really kind of shitty to each other when they use drugs. There's a lot of judgment. I was filming a documentary for W5 about fentanyl in Sault Ste. Marie 2 years ago. And this social worker had this great, I guess, metaphor example where, and I don't know if this actually happened. It sounds like it may have, but there was someone who was ODing on fentanyl, and there was someone at the other end of town who had a heart attack, and there's only one ambulance. And there's a hypothetical question: who does the ambulance choose to save? Most people would assume the heart attack victim, but when you dive deeper into it and you realize that the fentanyl person had some really bad life circumstances, they did it accidentally, they didn't know they were doing fentanyl, and then you look at the person who actually had the heart attack and realize that he smoked a pack of cigarettes a day and ate 2 Big Macs a day. Like, who really, when it comes down to, had a worse lifestyle? And I kind of found that to be a really interesting comparison.
Tell me a little bit about your media tour with the movie. How's that been going for you, and what have you experienced in that realm? Because I see, well, you're on the globe, you're everywhere lately. Well, I guess you should be to promote the movie, and it's just come out, so good on you. But what has your experience been dealing with the media in Canada and elsewhere?
It's been really positive. There's a lot of haters out there. When you talk about decrim and legalization, people think, listen, when people have kind of grown up with drug war mentality and kind of feel like all drugs are bad, then it's hard to change their opinions. You try to do your best. I mean, I love the response I'm getting from the medical community and doctors and social workers and psychology students. I was asked to speak next week actually at U of T to a bunch of psychology students, which is great.
Wow, cool.
So yeah, I think from that perspective, from kind of the medical community, harm reductionist doctors, they really appreciate it because they're kind of on the front lines and they understand that like evidence-based approaches to addiction are really needed. But yeah, I mean, I did a Reddit talk the other day. I was saying it before we got on.
Well, that must have been scary, man.
Yeah, and it was just like there's a lot of hatred. And it's like, and I'm
really,
you're trying to make an argument. Like, listen, this is what I believe in terms of decriminalization. Mm-hmm. Maybe we should begin to understand that in the future, legalizing other drugs could be a good idea. And it was a lot of like, dickish people, just kind of I couldn't. There wasn't anything I could say. And maybe this is me not being intelligent enough, but I had trouble in any way, shape, or form convincing them that, this may be a good idea. And I kind of felt like wherever I went, whatever argument I would put forth, people really felt that, drug users use drugs, they destroy their own lives. Basically, they've made their decision. Like, that's not my problem. And I think that's kind of a shitty attitude because we all live with problems, whether it's alcohol, whether it's, video game addiction, driving fast. Like, I just kind of feel like to isolate one community for the substances they put on their body is kind of ridiculous.
Amen. I agree with you there. So what you're saying is there's actually people on your AMAs, and Reddit's a scary place to, I don't go out on Reddit, but I've heard that's where it all starts type of thing, unless you're on 4chan. But you're telling me there's actually people that are passionately against legalization of drugs because they think, it's going to make the problem worse?
Yeah, absolutely. I think
wow.
So. But I mean, and that's kind of the reason I made Rat Park, because you really have to get into the history of the drug war, the history of harm reduction, understand drug policy, understand a lot of information to make a really informed decision. The history of Alcoholics Anonymous, how many people, are actually problem users compared to not problem users. Like, it's like anything. It's an idea. It's you talk about addiction. People have their surface comments about it and their like judgments, but to really understand it, you really have to dive deep and do a lot of research into all these topics. And I feel like it's not just, as simple as saying, hey, that's not my problem, I don't want it in my backyard, like forget it. There's so much to learn about it. So I would just encourage people to research what harm reduction actually means, and look at the statistics and look at the data when it comes to evidence-based treatment, and look at what happens in society when people have access to safe needles and methadone. Like HIV goes down. It's absolutely proven. It happens all over the place. So, it's just a matter of really spending the time and energy and doing a ton of research and understanding all the, political and psychological and addiction issues surrounded to the topic. And I feel like if more people did that, they'd have more compassion towards drug users and understand that this is a super complex topic. The problem is it just crosses so many lines between, drug policy, personal use, psychology. It's just all these different, types of science and sociology that you have to really understand to understand what's going on.
What's your intention for what people come away from after seeing the film?